What happened to the children of high-ranking Nazi leaders after World War II? You're probably already familiar with the Nuremberg trials and the names inscribed in history's darkest chapter: Frank, Himmler, Göring, Mengele. But chances are you're less familiar with what happened to the children who carried those names long after the verdicts were read and the sentences carried out. The story of Nazi Germany typically ends with the fall of Berlin in 1945 or the executions at Nuremberg in 1946. Yet for the sons and daughters left behind, that was only the beginning. The answer is far from simple. Some broke their silence and condemned their fathers publicly, tearing apart family bonds in the process. Others defended the indefensible until their dying breath, clinging to denial with a ferocity that shocked even fellow descendants. And still others chose a third path: quiet disappearance, building new lives under new names in distant countries, carrying secrets that would only surface decades later. To be absolutely clear, our intent is not to sympathize with these individuals or their ideology. We are simply interested in uncovering the human element of those who inherited a legacy of unimaginable horror, examining how they navigated a world that remembered what their fathers had done. What connects these stories is this: whether through condemnation, denial, or silence, none could truly escape. The children of the Third Reich grew up in what can only be described as a bubble of privilege, insulated from the realities of war, surrounded by luxury built on suffering, living in homes where atrocity was never discussed at the dinner table. Now let's examine how 6 of these children faced the legacies they inherited. If you want more stories like this, stories that go beyond hero myths and battlefield legends to uncover how wars are really decided, then stay with us here at Beyond History. We don't rush. We don't simplify. We slow down, examine the systems, the decisions, and the human cost behind the headlines. If this story helped you see World War II in a deeper way, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who thinks they already know how the war was won. Because history isn't just about what happened, it's about understanding why it happened. The only one who spoke, Nicholas Frank. Of Hans Frank's 5 children, only one refused to stay silent. Nicholas Frank was born on March 9, 1939, in Munich, into a Germany already on the brink of catastrophe. He was the youngest son of Hans Frank, the man who would later be known as the Butcher of Poland. When Nicholas was only 8 months old, his father was appointed Governor-General of occupied Poland, granting him near absolute power over the territory and its people. The Frank family soon relocated to Wawel Castle in Krakow, one of Poland's greatest cultural symbols, now draped in Nazi banners. Inside the castle's grand halls, surrounded by looted art and stolen treasures, the Frank children, Sigrid, Brigitte, Michael, Norman, and Nicholas, grew up in extraordinary privilege. The building was vast, the rooms filled with Renaissance architecture and priceless artifacts. Servants attended to them. They lacked nothing. If one ignored how this luxury had been obtained, the family might have appeared almost royal. But the foundation of that life was rotten. Hans Frank oversaw the enslavement of the Polish population and played a central role in the systematic destruction of Poland's Jewish community. He documented his work obsessively in detailed diaries, records that would later condemn him. Yet at home, to his children, he could still appear as a father, affectionate, attentive, seemingly ordinary. Decades later, Nicholas would say, "As a child, I knew I belonged to a family of criminals." That understanding, however, likely came slowly. As a boy, he probably sensed contradictions rather than fully grasping them. The extreme privilege, the reverence shown to his father, the conversations that stopped when children entered the room. Children notice such things even when they cannot yet name them. The collapse came quickly. In 1945, Hans Frank was captured by American forces and put on trial at Nuremberg. The evidence against him was overwhelming, much of it drawn from his own diaries. Deportations, starvation policies, mass murder, recorded in his own hand. On October 16, 1946, Hans Frank was hanged. Nicholas was 7 years old. That event marked him in a way it did not seem to mark his siblings. While the others tried to rebuild their lives and bury the past, Nicholas could not escape a single question. Who was my father, really, and what did that make me? He became a journalist, perhaps because journalism allowed him to investigate what others avoided. He made documentaries about the Nazi era, read trial transcripts, interviewed Holocaust survivors, and immersed himself in the history his family preferred not to confront. Over time, he assembled not a defense of his father, but a moral indictment. "I hated that man," Nicholas later wrote, "who even after his death continued to control me like a puppet." That hatred was not immediate. It grew as knowledge replaced childhood confusion. Shame hardened into anger as Nicholas fully understood the scale and intentionality of his father's crimes. In the 1980s, he published My Father, A Reckoning. The book was uncompromising, even shocking. Nicholas described Hans Frank as an unrepentant criminal responsible for immense suffering. He dismissed his father's last-minute conversion to Catholicism as a hollow gesture and stated openly that Hans Frank deserved his execution. He felt no grief, only relief. The reaction was explosive. His siblings cut off all contact. His brother Michael publicly accused him of betrayal. Other children of Nazi leaders condemned the book's harsh tone. For many in that generation, silence had been a psychological necessity. To confront their parents fully meant destroying the memories of love and safety that had defined their childhoods. Nicholas chose otherwise and paid the price. The family's later history was marked by fracture and tragedy. Sigrid, the eldest, emigrated to South Africa and defended apartheid, an irony Nicholas pointed out bitterly. Brigitte died by suicide in 1981. Michael died young, remembered by friends as deeply melancholic. Only Norman acknowledged historical responsibility, though quietly and without public confrontation. Nicholas's deepest regret concerned his mother. Brigitte Frank was not a passive bystander. As the wife of Poland's Nazi governor, she lived in luxury built on plunder, earning the nickname the Queen of Poland. She wore furs taken from Jewish families, traveled with SS escorts, and directly participated in the confiscation of Jewish property. Nicholas later recalled how she would visit markets accompanied by an SS driver, purchasing belongings from starving Jews forced to sell everything they owned. After the war, her world collapsed. She died in poverty in Munich in 1959, denying any knowledge of the crimes committed under her husband's rule. Nicholas never confronted her while she was alive. The questions he wanted to ask, what did you know? What did you see? What did you choose not to see? Remain unanswered. Yet by speaking out, by refusing silence, and by naming his father's crimes without evasion, Nicholas Frank became a rare voice of moral clarity. His life stands as a reminder that confronting the past, however painful, is not an act of betrayal, but a necessary step toward truth, responsibility, and the possibility of healing. The Garden Next to Hell. Brigitte Heirs. If Nicholas Frank's childhood was sheltered by castle walls and aristocratic illusion, Brigitte Heirs's was sheltered by something far more disturbing, willful ignorance maintained in the shadow of genocide. Brigitte was the youngest daughter of Rudolf Heirs, commandant of Auschwitz, the man who refined the industrial murder of more than 1 million people. The Heirs family lived in a villa just 200 meters from the gas chambers. The house, confiscated from a Polish family in 1940, had a garden, a swimming pool, wooden floors, green tiles, and a pleasant view, if one looked in the right direction. From certain windows, the smokestacks of the crematoria were likely visible. On still days, the smell of burning bodies may have drifted across the yard where the children played. The sounds of the camp, shouted orders, trucks, screams, the constant hum of the ovens, were part of the background of daily life. For me, the rows of prisoners in striped suits were nothing more than part of the daily landscape. Brigitte later recalled. It is a chilling statement. To the child she was, the prisoners were not individuals in torment. They were simply there, like the fence, the garden, the iron gate bearing the words Arbeit macht frei, a lie so vast it became invisible through repetition. While Brigitte and her siblings, Klaus, Heide, Ingebrigit, Hans-Jürgen and Annegret, played in the garden and swam in the pool, prisoners worked just beyond the fence under armed guard. Some of them may have watched the children, wondering whether their own children were still alive, wondering if they would ever see them again. The Hearst children likely understood little, or learned not to ask. Children can normalize almost anything when adults treat it as ordinary. Rudolf Hearst himself embodied contradiction. Psychologist Gustav Gilbert described him as intellectually normal, but profoundly insensitive. Primo Levi called him an empty man, whose blind obedience protected him from doubt. In his memoirs, written before execution, Hearst claimed he never questioned orders and felt little guilt, conceding only faintly, and late, that perhaps it had all been wrong. At home, however, he played with his children, took them on walks, and behaved like a conventional father. This ability to compartmentalize, the monstrous and the mundane, is one of the most disturbing truths of these stories. After Germany's defeat, the illusion collapsed. Hearst briefly considered killing his entire family, then abandoned the idea, claiming concern for his children. Instead, they fled, hiding among other fallen Nazi families. In 1946, Rudolf Hearst was captured by British forces after his wife revealed his identity. He was tried in Poland, where his crimes had been committed. On April 16, 1947, he was hanged at Auschwitz, on a gallows erected near the villa where his children had once played, within sight of the crematoria that had defined his rule. For the children, the fall was immediate. Their mother, Hedwig, struggled through shortages and freezing winters. Coal was stolen to survive. Shoes and food were scarce. The garden and swimming pool were replaced by daily desperation. Hedwig later remarried and emigrated to the United States, living quietly in Washington. Klaus moved to Australia, where his marriage failed. He died in the 1980s from liver cirrhosis, likely fueled by years of heavy drinking. In 1950, Brigitte chose distance. She immigrated to Spain, determined to escape both Germany and memory. Beautiful and poised, she became a model for Balenciaga in Madrid. She never spoke of her father. She shed the name Hearst entirely. Silence, she had learned, was survival. In 1961, she married an Irish-American engineer. Their life became nomadic. Liberia, Greece, Iran, Vietnam, each move another layer of separation from the past. Eventually, they settled in Washington, D.C., where Brigitte worked in luxury retail, including Saks Fifth Avenue. No one knew who she was. On one occasion, she revealed her secret to her boss, a Jewish woman who had fled Nazi Germany. Instead of condemnation, Brigitte received compassion. She had been a child. What choice had she had? It was a rare moment of grace. For decades, Brigitte spoke no further. She feared exposure and violence. More than anything, she did not want to burden her children and grandchildren with Auschwitz. Only in 2013, terminally ill and 80 years old, did she agree to a single interview with journalist Thomas Harding, the great-nephew of the British officer who had captured her father. In that final interview, Brigitte spoke of the villa, the garden, the shock of the war's end, and the lifelong anxiety of being discovered. She questioned some details, echoes of the denial woven into her childhood, but she accepted the reality of the Holocaust and acknowledged her father's role. "I feared reprisals," she said, "and I did not want to burden my family with my story." She kept a photograph of her parents on their wedding day, young, hopeful, before the camps. She called it a memory of simpler times. But simplicity was an illusion. The past could be hidden behind new names, new countries, and decades of silence, but never erased. The girl who played in the garden next to hell carried that garden with her for the rest of her life, whether she spoke of it or not. The son who learned too late, Ricardo Eichmann. Some secrets are too large to keep forever. For Ricardo Eichmann, the truth did not arrive in a single devastating moment. It came slowly, in fragments, a photograph glimpsed in a magazine, half-finished sentences that stopped when he entered a room, a surname that carried a weight no one would explain to him. He was born in 1955 in Buenos Aires, Argentina, the youngest son of a man who called himself Ricardo Clement. The family lived in Olivos, a quiet, middle-class suburb. It was the kind of neighborhood designed to disappear into normalcy: modest houses, familiar faces, children playing freely in the streets. His father worked at the Mercedes-Benz plant, advancing steadily until he became a department head. It was respectable work, the kind that invited neither admiration nor suspicion. That anonymity was deliberate. Ricardo Clement was not who he claimed to be. His real name was Adolf Eichmann, one of the principal architects of the Holocaust, the man who transformed genocide into a logistical system. Eichmann did not kill with his own hands. He did something far more chilling. He organized the machinery, the trains, the schedules, the deportation lists. He treated mass murder as an administrative problem, something to be optimized through paperwork and efficiency. After Germany's defeat in 1945, Eichmann was briefly captured by American forces. Lacking the SS blood group tattoo and using an alias, he slipped through their grasp. Released unnoticed, he vanished into the chaos of post-war Europe. In 1948, aided by escape networks linked to Bishop Alois Hudal, Eichmann fled along the so-called monastery route. With forged documents and sympathetic intermediaries, he reached Argentina and rebuilt himself as Ricardo Clement, a new country, a new name, a carefully erased past. His wife Vera and his 3 older sons, Klaus, Horst, and Dieter, joined him in the early 1950s. The family reunited under their assumed identity. And then, in 1955, Ricardo was born, the youngest child, the one raised entirely within the lie. For the first 5 years of his life, Ricardo knew only an ordinary father, a man who went to work each morning and returned each evening, a man who sat at the dinner table, helped with schoolwork, and told bedtime stories. There was no hint of flight, no sense of danger. Childhood felt safe. Then, on May 11th, 1960, that world vanished. Mossad agents captured Adolf Eichmann on a Buenos Aires street corner as he walked home from work. The operation was swift and precise. Eichmann was subdued, hidden, drugged, and held in a safe house. 9 days later, he was smuggled onto a plane and flown to Israel. The Argentine government was not informed. History would not wait for permission. Ricardo was 5 years old. One day his father was there. The next, he was gone. No explanation that made sense to a child. No goodbye. The absence must have felt personal, as absences often do to children, confusing, frightening, and strangely shameful. Had he done something wrong? Would his father return? Ricardo Clement never came back because Ricardo Clement had never truly existed. The truth emerged slowly. His mother and older brothers had always known who Adolf Eichmann was. Ricardo had been shielded, perhaps out of misplaced mercy. But secrets of that magnitude cannot be contained forever. When Ricardo finally learned who his father was, the revelation shattered his understanding of himself. The man whose name filled history books, whose face appeared in newspapers and documentaries, was the same man who had once lifted him onto his shoulders. The question became unavoidable. Who am I, if this is who my father was? Eichmann's trial in Jerusalem unfolded before the world. Survivors testified to deportations, hunger, suffocation, and death. Eichmann sat in a bulletproof glass booth, calm, bureaucratic, insisting he had only followed orders. The court rejected that defense. Genocide organized through paperwork was still genocide. In December 1961, Eichmann was sentenced to death. He was hanged on May 31, 1962. His ashes were scattered at sea so that no nation would have to accept him, even in death. Ricardo was 7 years old. His older half-brothers responded with denial. Klaus and Horst defended their father and clung to Nazi ideology, even wearing SS uniforms in their youth. They chose loyalty over truth. Ricardo chose distance. In the 1970s, he left Argentina and moved to Germany, the country his father had helped devastate. At the University of Heidelberg, he studied archaeology and ancient history. He immersed himself in civilizations long dead, perhaps seeking a past untouched by modern atrocity. Through discipline and scholarship, he built an identity grounded in knowledge rather than blood. Over time, he earned respect in his field. From 1996 to 2020, he served as director of the Orient Department at the German Archaeological Institute in Berlin. In professional circles, he became known simply as Ricardo Eichmann, archaeologist and scholar. In 1995, he agreed to meet Zvi Aharoni, one of the Mossad agents who had captured his father. Ricardo spoke little about the meeting afterward, describing it only as deeply revealing. To face the man who ended his father's freedom and enabled justice must have carried a complex mix of gratitude, resentment, and closure. Ricardo Eichmann has rarely spoken publicly. He guards his privacy carefully. When he does speak, his message is consistent and restrained. I want my life to be defined by my academic work, not by the legacy of Adolf Eichmann. The rift between him and his brothers remains absolute. When asked what they think of his openness, he answered simply, "You should ask them." As a teenager, Ricardo later admitted he sometimes envied children whose fathers had died in accidents or from illness. Their grief was clean, their memories uncorrupted. They could mourn without shame. At 13 or 14, he opened a magazine and saw an image that sealed his understanding. The noose used to execute his father. Rope, not finality. In that moment, he said, he fully grasped what Adolf Eichmann had been, and what it meant to carry that name. It was a truth learned too late to change anything, but impossible to forget. A burden he would carry quietly for the rest of his life. The meeting that changed nothing. Rolf Mengele. Of all the Nazi war criminals who escaped justice, few were as notorious or as elusive as Josef Mengele, the man history would come to know as the Angel of Death of Auschwitz. At the camp, Mengele served as chief physician, a title that concealed a reality of extraordinary cruelty. Obsessed with racial theory and the fantasy of Aryan biological superiority, he treated human beings as raw material. Twins fascinated him most. They were measured, injected, mutilated, and dissected. He performed surgeries without anesthesia, amputated healthy limbs, infected prisoners with lethal diseases, and attempted to change eye color through chemical injections. Suffering for Mengele was not a moral problem, it was data. When the Soviet Red Army liberated Auschwitz in January 1945, Mengele was already gone. He fled 10 days earlier, sensing the collapse of the world that had protected him. Like many others, he moved west, blending into the chaos of defeat. Briefly detained by American forces, he concealed his identity, presenting himself as a low-ranking Wehrmacht medic named Josef Memling. Without the SS blood group tattoo and armed with plausible papers, he passed unnoticed. He was released. History missed its chance. For several years, Mengele drifted through Germany under false names, supported by a network of former SS officers, sympathizers, and silent enablers. In 1949, he secured a Red Cross passport under the name Helmut Gregor and escaped to Argentina, one of many destinations where Nazi fugitives found shelter far from Europe's reckoning. He arrived in Buenos Aires in July 1949 and constructed a new, ordinary life. He worked first as a carpenter, later selling agricultural machinery. For a time, confident that the world's attention had shifted elsewhere, he even lived openly under his real name. It was arrogance, but it worked, at least for a while. Yet the life he built in South America was incomplete. In Germany, he had left behind his wife Irene and his son Rolf. The separation was deliberate. Mengele believed distance was protection. If he were captured, his family could deny knowledge. They could remain untouched by his crimes. Safety, he thought, lay in silence and absence. Rolf grew up without his father, raised by his mother in post-war Germany. The absence was explained, but never examined too closely. Perhaps he was told his father worked abroad. Perhaps that he would return someday. Whatever the explanation, Rolf's childhood was shaped by a man who existed more as a shadow than a presence. In 1956, when Rolf was around 12 years old, that shadow suddenly took form. Arrangements were made for him to meet his father, but under a lie. Josef Mengele appeared not as a father, but as Uncle Fritz, a family friend visiting Switzerland. The deception was careful, even tender in its own twisted way. Uncle Fritz was attentive, friendly, generous. He took Rolf skiing in the Alps. They spent days together. Rolf enjoyed himself. He felt chosen, noticed, valued. He had no idea who the man really was. The person teaching him to ski, laughing with him over meals, was the same man who had stood on the selection ramp at Auschwitz, deciding who would live and who would die with a flick of the wrist. The same man who sent children like Rolf, into laboratories and gas chambers. The meeting ended. Uncle Fritz disappeared. Rolf returned to Germany. Life resumed its course. More than 2 decades passed before father and son saw each other again. In 1977, Mengele's lawyer Hans Sedlmayr tracked Rolf down. The reason was practical, but cloaked in ideology. Mengele was aging, isolated, and increasingly desperate in Brazil. He needed money. But Sedlmayr also wanted something else: reconciliation, or at least understanding. He tried to frame Josef Mengele as a man of his time, shaped by war, misunderstood by history. Rolf listened, but he was no longer a child. He had spent years reading about the Holocaust, confronting the reality of Auschwitz, understanding precisely what his father had done. Still, he agreed to meet him. Perhaps he hoped for remorse. Perhaps an apology. Perhaps some sign that the man responsible for so much suffering had finally understood. Using a borrowed passport, obtained through deception, Rolf traveled in secret to Brazil. The journey itself carried risk, but Rolf pressed on. Some confrontations feel unavoidable, no matter the cost. The meeting was a shock. The man Rolf encountered was not a tragic figure crushed by history, but a bitter, paranoid old man who clung stubbornly to his beliefs. Josef Mengele expressed no regret. He insisted he had been a good doctor, that his work had been necessary, that history had slandered him. Rolf, whose own political views leaned sharply left, argued with his father. Their clash was total, ideological, moral, emotional. There was no bridge between them. "I will never understand how human beings could behave in that way," Rolf would later say. The meeting achieved nothing. Josef Mengele remained unchanged. The son left knowing that the truth he sought did not exist. It was the last time they met. On February 7, 1979, Josef Mengele suffered a stroke while swimming off a beach in Bertioga, Brazil. He drowned in shallow water, He died as he had lived in exile, alone, hidden, under a false name. He was buried as Wolfgang Gerhardt in a São Paulo cemetery. For years, rumors persisted that he was still alive. Sightings were reported across South America. The myth lingered. In 1985, forensic evidence ended it. Dental records and skeletal analysis confirmed the truth. The angel of death was finally, undeniably dead. Rolf Mengeler's response was quiet but decisive. He rejected his inheritance. He abandoned the name Mengele, legally severing himself from it. He settled in Munich and worked as a lawyer, building a life grounded in his own choices rather than his father's crimes. It was not a public denunciation like Nicholas Frank's. It was something colder, perhaps firmer. Refusal. By walking away, by rejecting the name, the money, and the legacy, Rolf Mengele made clear that some histories cannot be redeemed, only rejected. He never spoke publicly about his father again. The faithful daughter, Gudrun Himmler. Not every child of a Nazi leader broke with the past. Some clung to it with a loyalty so absolute that it seemed to defy reason, evidence, and even time itself. Gudrun Himmler belonged firmly to that group. Until her death, she remained convinced that history had been profoundly unjust to her father. Heinrich Himmler, Reichsführer SS, architect of the Holocaust, and one of the central figures of Nazi terror. Gudrun was born in 1929, the only legitimate child of Heinrich Himmler and his wife Margareta. Though Himmler would later father 2 more children with his longtime mistress Hedwig Potthast, Gudrun held a unique place in his emotional world. He called her Puppy, little doll, and she adored him with the uncritical devotion that only a child can give. Her childhood diary, preserved after the war, offers an unsettling glimpse into that bond. Page after page records excitement whenever her father visited, called, or sent gifts. On August 1, 1943, she wrote with unfiltered pride, "Daddy is the Reich's interior minister. I'm ecstatic." To Gudrun, her father's rise meant success, importance, validation. Power, in her world, was not frightening. It was admirable. Despite overseeing the SS and the machinery of mass murder, Himmler made deliberate efforts to remain present in his daughter's life. His personal calendars and agendas, documents that survived the war, show frequent entries noting phone calls home, brief visits, and moments spent playing with Puppy. Even while coordinating deportations and extermination policies, he compartmentalized himself as a caring father. That compartmentalization reached its most disturbing expression one afternoon in the early 1940s. Himmler took Gudrun on a visit to Dachau, the first concentration camp, located only a short distance from Munich. Dachau had been established in 1933 under Himmler's authority, and he regarded it as a model institution, ordered, disciplined, controlled. As they walked through the camp, Himmler explained the system of prisoner identification, pointing out the colored triangles sewn onto uniforms, red for political prisoners, black for criminals. He spoke calmly, instructively, as though giving a lesson in civic organization. What did Gudrun see? Years later, she would recall not the prisoners' faces, but the camp garden, the greenhouse, the neat rows of vegetables. She remembered her father explaining how important it was that the plants were well tended. He even allowed her to pluck a few leaves. She was 12 years old. The men working that soil, emaciated, beaten, slowly dying, appear in her memory not as human beings, but as part of the background, absorbed into the scenery. Whether she truly did not understand, or had learned not to understand, is impossible to know. Children raised within totalitarian systems often develop this selective blindness early. They learn which questions are dangerous. They learn which truths are unspeakable. Throughout the war, Gudrun remained insulated. While cities burned and millions died, she attended school, worried abstractly about her father's safety, and absorbed the war through propaganda and reassurance. In July 1944, as Germany's defeat loomed, she wrote in her diary, "Everyone firmly believes in victory, especially father. So as his daughter, I am obligated to believe as well. Losing would be unthinkable." Himmler's letters to her were brief and sanitized. He wrote about stomach pains, exhaustion, and hopes of coming home for Christmas. He never mentioned camps, never mentioned death. He signed with affection, reinforcing the image Gudrun clung to, a dutiful man burdened by responsibility, not a mass murderer. That image collapsed in 1945. On May 13th, Gudrun and her mother were arrested by British forces in northern Italy. They were attempting to flee south when they were detained and transferred between interrogation centers. Margareta denied all knowledge of her husband's crimes, insisting Heinrich had never discussed his work. Whether this was self-deception or deliberate lying remains unresolved. 10 days later, Heinrich Himmler killed himself with a cyanide capsule after his capture. Margareta reportedly reacted with cold detachment. Gudrun did not. She learned of her father's death accidentally, overhearing it rather than being formally told. The shock was devastating. She became seriously ill, running a high fever and drifting in and out of delirium. She refused to believe he had taken his own life. She insisted he had been murdered. And she rejected absolutely the accusations against him. "He was a good man," she would repeat for the rest of her life. "He was my father." After the war, Gudrun and her mother were held at Camp 77 in Ludwigsburg. Conditions were harsh: scarce food, poor sanitation, constant uncertainty. Eventually, they found refuge in a Catholic convent. Gudrun accepted shelter but kept her distance, refusing religious instruction or guidance. Faith, like everything else, was filtered through her loyalty to her father. When she emerged into civilian life, rejection followed her everywhere. Schools refused her. Employers turned her away. Landlords declined to rent to her once they learned her surname. Yet Gudrun refused to change it. The name Himmler was her burden, and her defiance. In 1951, she found purpose. She joined Stille Hilfe, Silent Help, an organization dedicated to supporting imprisoned and fugitive Nazi war criminals. The group raised money for legal defenses, assisted escapes, and argued that convicted Nazis were victims of victor's justice. It played a role in aiding figures such as Josef Mengele and Adolf Eichmann. Gudrun became one of its most devoted members. She visited imprisoned SS men, delivered care packages, wrote letters, and campaigned tirelessly for early releases. Her devotion mirrored her father's: disciplined, unwavering, ideological. One of the most notorious cases involved Anton Maloth, a convicted concentration camp guard. Gudrun helped secure him residence in a comfortable retirement home, partly funded by public money. She visited him regularly until his death, seeing not a murderer, but a comrade unjustly treated. In 1959, Gudrun gave her only major interview. Her words were unequivocal. "Today my father is considered the greatest genocidal murderer of all time. I want to modify that view." She never did, but she never stopped trying. She married Wolf-Dieter Berwitz, a far-right extremist, and remained active in neo-Nazi circles for decades. She attended SS commemorations, supported extremist causes, and continued to deny or minimize the Holocaust. To her, the true victims were people like herself, children punished for loving their fathers. Within her own family, a stark contrast emerged. Her great-niece Katrin Himmler confronted the family legacy openly, marrying into a Jewish family and writing critically about Himmler history. The divergence illustrated a central truth: inheritance does not dictate morality. Choice does. Gudrun Himmler died in 2018 at the age of 88. She had spent her entire life defending a man responsible for mass murder. She never expressed doubt, never apologized, never stepped out of his shadow. She did not forget. She did not forgive. She did not break away. She remained faithful to the end. The Princess and the Fortune. Edda Göring. If Gudrun Himmler was the most fervent ideological defender of her father's memory, Edda Göring was perhaps the most persistent in fighting for something more concrete and tangible: her father's confiscated fortune. Edda was born on June 2, 1938, into what can only be described as a spectacle. The birth of Hermann Göring's only child was treated as a national event. Bells rang throughout the Reich. More than 628,000 congratulatory telegrams arrived at the Göring residence. German newsreels covered the birth as major news, with footage of the proud father and the newborn girl. Adolf Hitler himself became Edda's godfather, an honor that in the context of Nazi Germany carried enormous symbolic weight. He showered the infant with gifts and showed her special affection throughout her early childhood. In propaganda footage from the era, you can see Hitler holding young Edda, smiling as she takes her first wobbly steps toward him, his normally stern face softening into something approaching genuine warmth. She was called the Princess of the Third Reich, and in many ways she lived like one. The Göring family residence was filled with artwork and treasures looted from across occupied Europe. Hermann Göring was an obsessive art collector, and he used his position and power to amass one of the most valuable private collections in the world. His collection included approximately 1,400 paintings, 250 sculptures, 168 antique tapestries, 60 Persian and French carpets, and thousands of rare books and manuscripts. Much of it had been seized from Jewish families, stolen from museums in occupied territories, or acquired through forced sales where the sellers had no real choice but to accept whatever pittance Göring offered. Edda grew up surrounded by this stolen beauty, attended by servants wanting for nothing. In the twisted logic of Nazi Germany, she was royalty, the daughter of the second most powerful man in the regime, the goddaughter of the Führer himself. But Nazi Germany's royalty was built on sand. When the war turned against Germany, when Allied forces closed in from east and west, that carefully constructed world collapsed. Hermann Göring was captured by American forces in May 1945. He was brought to Nuremberg, tried alongside the other top Nazi leaders, and convicted of war crimes, crimes against peace, and crimes against humanity. The evidence against him was overwhelming. He was sentenced to death by hanging. But Göring would not give his executioners the satisfaction. On October 15, 1946, just hours before his scheduled execution, he took his own life by swallowing a cyanide capsule that had somehow been smuggled into his cell. How he obtained it remains a matter of historical debate. Some believe a sympathetic guard provided it. Others think he had hidden it on his person for months, perhaps years. Edda was 8 years old when her father died. The vast Göring art collection was confiscated by the Allies. Some pieces were returned to their rightful owners or to the museums from which they had been stolen. Others were sold at auction. Still others disappeared into private collections, their provenance quietly obscured. Edda received nothing. The painting from her christening, the playhouse that had been built for her by Luftwaffe officers in the forests of Karenhall, the luxury items that had filled her childhood, all of it was gone, confiscated as the proceeds of crime. Her mother, Emmy Göring, attempted to rebuild some semblance of a life in post-war Germany, but it was not easy. The Göring name carried weight, but not the kind that opened doors. They lived modestly, far from the opulence of the Reich years. For decades, Edda lived quietly in Munich, largely avoiding public attention. She maintained ties with circles nostalgic for Nazism, attending gatherings in Bayreuth at the home of Wagner's descendants, a family known for their affinity with the Third Reich and their ongoing reluctance to fully confront that historical connection. But for the most part, Edda stayed out of the spotlight, living in relative obscurity in the Lehel district of Munich, an aristocratic bearing about her that spoke of a different time. Then, in 2015, on the 70th anniversary of the end of World War II, Edda made international headlines. She filed a legal claim with Bavarian authorities, demanding compensation for her father's confiscated fortune. In her petition, she stated, "This is about compensation for the expropriation of my inheritance in 1948. The assets that belonged to my father were expropriated post-mortem. I am seeking a modest sum to allow me to live with dignity." It was a remarkable claim, audacious in its apparent failure to acknowledge the source of that wealth. The assets in question had been stolen from Jewish families and occupied nations. They were the proceeds of looting and theft on a massive scale. To claim them as legitimate inheritance required a stunning moral blindness. It was not the first time Edda had sought to recover part of her father's collection. In 1968, she had litigated for years over the Cranach painting that had been given to her at her christening, arguing that it was her personal property and should not have been included in the general confiscation of Goering's collection. The case went all the way to the Federal Court of Germany, which ruled in 1968 that while the painting might technically have been a personal gift to the infant Edda, its acquisition had been fundamentally immoral, seized from a museum under duress, and therefore it rightfully belonged back in that museum's collection. Now, at an advanced age, Edda was trying again. According to journalist Wolfgang Wüst, who covered the story, the reasons behind this new claim remained somewhat unclear. Perhaps it was nostalgia for the lost luxury of her childhood, a longing for the life she had once known. Perhaps it was pressure from relatives or associates who stood to inherit from her and saw an opportunity for financial gain. Or perhaps it was simply the stubborn refusal to let go of a past that no longer existed, an insistence that history had been unfair to her and her family. The Bavarian parliament unanimously rejected her request. The decision was swift and unequivocal. There would be no compensation, no partial return of the collection, no acknowledgement of Edda's claim as legitimate. It was not the answer she had hoped for, but it was the answer history demanded. Throughout her life, Edda Goering clung to the material and symbolic legacy of her father, unable or unwilling to let go of a past the world had condemned. She still retains her aristocratic demeanor, attending court proceedings with an elegance reminiscent of the girl who once sat on Hitler's lap, who once played with toys worth more than most people's annual income, who once believed she truly was a princess. But the world has moved on. The fortune she seeks remains out of reach, not because it was destroyed, but because it was never legitimately hers to begin with. It was stolen property, the proceeds of crime, built on the suffering of millions. And no amount of legal maneuvering or appeals to dignity could change that fundamental truth. The industrialists' heirs. While the children of Nazi leaders struggled beneath infamous surnames and shattered legacies, another group of heirs faced a profoundly different inheritance. These were the descendants of Germany's industrialists, the families whose wealth had grown through collaboration with the Nazi regime, and who, unlike the Franks, Himmlers, or Goerings, emerged from the war with their fortunes largely intact. On February 20th, 1933, only weeks after Adolf Hitler became Chancellor, a secret meeting took place in Berlin. Hitler summoned roughly 20 of Germany's most powerful industrialists to Hermann Goering's official residence. The purpose was straightforward. An election was approaching, and the Nazi Party needed money. In exchange, Hitler offered something far more valuable than ideology: access, protection, and profit. Among those present were representatives of companies whose names remain familiar today: BMW, Volkswagen, Bayer, Porsche, Hugo Boss. These were not marginal firms operating on the fringes of legality. They were pillars of German industry. Some of the men in the room were not particularly impressed by Hitler. Günther Quandt, for example, later described him in private writings as crude and theatrical, more demagogue than statesman. But such judgments were irrelevant. What mattered was calculation. Hitler was rising. Resistance would be costly. Cooperation promised opportunity. They funded him. In return, they gained unprecedented access to state contracts, political favor, and a regime willing to clear away legal and moral obstacles in the name of national renewal. As Germany rearmed and then expanded through conquest, these companies thrived. One of the regime's most lucrative policies was Aryanization, the systematic seizure of Jewish-owned businesses and property. Under Nazi law, Jewish families were forced to sell assets at a fraction of their value or surrender them outright. Industrialists like August von Fink took over banks and financial institutions, including Rothschild holdings, at fire sale prices. It was theft legalized by bureaucracy. More damning still was the use of forced labor. As the war intensified and German manpower dwindled, millions of prisoners, POWs, civilians from occupied territories, concentration camp inmates, were compelled to work in factories under brutal conditions. They were paid little or nothing, fed starvation rations, beaten, and worked until they collapsed. Those who died were replaced without pause. Günter Quandt's enterprises exploited nearly 60,000 forced laborers. At Volkswagen, over 20,000 prisoners produced vehicles between 1942 and 1945. Mortality rates were high. Exhaustion and disease were routine. The system was efficient, profitable, and deadly. When the war ended, there was a brief moment when it appeared this collaboration might carry consequences. Allied denazification efforts investigated many industrialists. Some were arrested. A few faced trial. But the reckoning was limited. Only one major industrialist, Friedrich Flick, was prosecuted at Nuremberg. Convicted in 1947 for slave labor and plunder, he received a 7-year sentence. Others, including Günter Quandt and Ferry Porsche, served short terms or were released quickly. Most retained their core assets, losing only properties in the Soviet-controlled Eastern Zone. Flick himself was released in 1950 after a sentence reduction. At that moment, it seemed his empire might be finished. Instead, it rebounded spectacularly. By 1960, Flick had regained his status as Germany's richest man, largely through his holdings in Daimler-Benz. When he died in 1972, his fortune rivaled that of global oil magnates. The pattern repeated elsewhere. Herbert Quandt rescued BMW from collapse in the 1950s and transformed it into a global luxury brand. Ferry Porsche rebuilt Porsche into an automotive icon. The post-war economic miracle of West Germany provided both cover and opportunity. The Quandt family offers perhaps the most revealing case. Harold Quandt was the son of Günter Quandt and Magda Ritschl. After their divorce, Magda married Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's Minister of Propaganda. Harold grew up in the Goebbels household, surrounded by Nazi ideology and its rituals, while maintaining ties to his biological father and the family business. On May 1, 1945, as the Reich collapsed, Magda Goebbels poisoned her 6 children in Hitler's bunker before killing herself alongside her husband. Harold was spared only because he was a prisoner of war in North Africa. He learned of their deaths through a farewell letter from his mother, a document that combined fanaticism with maternal finality. Harold survived. He returned to Germany in 1947. When Günter Quandt died in 1954, Harold and his half-brother Herbert inherited the empire. They inherited not guilt, but capital. A 14% stake in Daimler-Benz, major holdings in BMW, control over companies that had thrived under Nazi rule and now flourished in peacetime. Today, the Quandt family remains among the wealthiest in Germany, their fortune measured in tens of billions. Unlike the children of Nazi leaders, these heirs were not burdened with names that symbolized genocide. They were not confronted by tribunals or public outrage. Their family histories were quietly reframed as stories of entrepreneurial resilience and post-war rebuilding. They became respectable. This contrast is uncomfortable. The political and military architects of Nazi terror were tried, condemned, and executed. Their children bore the weight of history in their names. But the businessmen who enabled the system, who profited from its crimes, largely escaped with their wealth intact, passing it down to future generations. History remembers Frank, Himmler, Göring, and Mengele as symbols of evil. It rarely speaks the names Quandt, Flick, or Porsche in the same breath, despite their role in sustaining the same machinery of exploitation and death. The difference was not moral responsibility. It was survivability. The industrialists did not need to believe, they only needed to invest, and their heirs live with the returns. Conclusion: the weight of names. The Nuremberg trials ended decades ago. The last Nazi leaders were convicted and executed, and the world moved on, rebuilding from the ruins of the most destructive war in human history. But for the children of those Nazi leaders, the reckoning never truly ended. They carried names that history had judged and condemned. They inherited legacies they never chose, bore the weight of crimes they did not commit, and faced a world that could never quite decide whether they deserved compassion or contempt. Some, like Nicholas Frank, chose condemnation. He stood in the light and named his father's evil in clear and uncompromising language, even when it cost him his family, his relationships, and any chance at a quiet life. He became a voice of unflinching honesty, refusing to let sentiment or familial loyalty obscure the truth of what his father had done. Others, like Ricardo Eichmann, chose silence and scholarship. He built a life as far from his father's legacy as he could manage, becoming an expert in ancient civilizations rather than confronting the modern horror his father had helped create. He never publicly condemned Adolf Eichmann, but he never defended him either. He simply walked away, choosing to be defined by his own work rather than his father's crimes. Rolf Mengele followed a similar path, walking away from his inheritance and his name. He rejected everything his father represented, not through public statements or books, but through quiet action, changing his name, refusing the money, building a life that was entirely his own. Brigitte Heirs lived in the space between condemnation and acceptance. She carried her father's memory with complicated feelings she never fully resolved. She loved the man who had been her father, the man who had played with her in the garden. But she also came to understand, in her final years, what he had done just meters away from that garden. She lived with that contradiction until her death, never quite able to reconcile the two images of Rudolf Heirs. And then there were those who refused to let go, who clung to denial with a ferocity that shocked even fellow descendants of Nazis. Gudrun Himmler spent her entire life defending her father, convinced until her death that history had been fundamentally unjust to Heinrich Himmler. She worked tirelessly to rehabilitate his reputation, to help other Nazi war criminals escape justice, to preserve the ideology that had led to so much suffering. She never showed remorse, she never acknowledged doubt. She died as she had lived, her father's faithful daughter. Edda Göring fought for a fortune built on theft, for artwork stolen from Jewish families and museums in occupied territories. She could not or would not see the blood on the gold, the suffering that had purchased her childhood luxury. Even in old age, she continued to petition for compensation, to argue that history had treated her unfairly, that she deserved something from the wreckage of her father's empire. These were the children of the Third Reich, heirs to a legacy of unimaginable horror. None of them chose their fathers. None of them committed the crimes that made those names infamous. But all of them, in one way or another, had to decide how to carry the weight of names that history had judged. Some chose honesty, facing the truth no matter how painful. Others chose silence, building new lives in the hope that distance might eventually mean freedom. Still others chose denial, defending the indefensible and living in a past that should have been left behind. But whatever path they chose, none could truly escape. The past followed them. The names followed them. The questions followed them. What did you know? What should you have done? How do you live with this? History does not offer them absolution. It cannot erase what their fathers did or undo the suffering those actions caused. But it can offer something else, the truth. And for some of these children, that truth became liberation, a way to acknowledge the past, confront it honestly, and move forward without the burden of lies and denial. For others, that same truth became a prison they never left, a reality too painful to accept, too enormous to confront. They chose instead to live in fantasy, in revision, in the desperate hope that if they denied it long enough, loudly enough, history might somehow change its verdict. It never did. The children of Nazi leaders remind us that evil's consequences ripple outward through generations, that the sins of the fathers cast shadows that can last lifetimes. But they also remind us of something more hopeful, that each generation has a choice, that we are not bound by the actions of those who came before us, that it is possible to break with the past, to name it honestly, to build something different. The weight of names can be crushing, but it need not be eternal. If you found this deep dive into history compelling, be sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next exploration of the past's untold stories. Next time, we'll uncover another chapter that shaped our world, one that deserves to be remembered, examined, and understood. History isn't just about dates and battles. It's about people, choices, and the legacies we leave behind. See you in the next one.